Clara was nervously adjusting her uniform. As she made her way down the narrow aisle of the plane, she had been a flight attendant for over a year, but today felt different. It was her first solo flight, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something unexpected was going to happen. The cabin was buzzing with the hem of passengers, talking in hushed tones. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, she checked her watch and smiled to herself, almost to calm her nerves. Knowing this was her chance to prove she was ready for more responsibility, she took a deep breath and turned her attention to the passengers, starting her service with a warm smile and a cheerful greeting. But when she reached row 22, she noticed the man sitting by the window in a military jacket that had clearly seen better days. His face was weathered, his grey hair neatly combed back, though his eyes were clouded with something far beyond the routine discomfort of air travel. Clara had seen hundreds of passengers in her short time on the job, but something about him felt different. His eyes were too focused, his gaze far too intense for someone just trying to get to their destination. She couldn't help herself as she slid past him, offering her typical greeting. "Good afternoon, sir. What can I get you today?" she asked brightly, but his eyes barely moved. His focus stayed locked on the small patch of sky outside the window. Clara chuckled nervously, hoping to ease the awkwardness. "You must have flown more miles than I've been alive, huh?" she said with a half-hearted laugh, trying to break the silence. But the man didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. Clara shifted uncomfortably, but instead of retreating, she made the decision to continue her service. She didn't want to appear unprofessional, but there was something about this man's silence that sent an eerie chill down her spine. Maybe it was his calm, or maybe it was the tension that seemed to build in the small space between them, but something felt off. She leaned in a little closer and tried again. Must have some crazy stories to tell from back in the day. Her voice was warmer this time. She was genuinely trying to connect, but his eyes remained fixed on the window. His lips didn't even twitch. "Don't be shy," she said, half laughing to herself, thinking it was all in good fun. Surely this man would crack a smile. But then, just as she was about to move on, something unexpected happened. The man's hand slowly moved to his side, and for a split second Clara caught the glint of a faded military insignia on his sleeve. The insignia wasn't something she immediately recognized, but it looked old, too old. She couldn't help herself. Her curiosity got the better of her. "You've got some pretty serious patches there," she said with a raised eyebrow pointing at his sleeve. "What unit were you in?" The veteran's eyes flickered, but he didn't turn toward her. He didn't even move. But Clara could swear that in that moment his body seemed to stiffen just a little more. The air seemed to grow thicker between them. And for the first time since boarding, Clara realized she wasn't dealing with a simple old man traveling on a plane. She was dealing with someone who carried a history, something she wasn't sure she was ready to understand. Before she could speak again, the captain's voice came over the intercom, instructing passengers to fasten their seatbelts as they were about to take off. Clara smiled politely at the man in seat 22 and moved on. She tried to shake the feeling that had settled in her stomach, but it lingered in the back of her mind like a shadow that refused to leave. As the plane ascended and the familiar sounds of the engines roared to life, Clara went about her duties, offering drinks and snacks. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the man in row 22. She couldn't explain it, but there was something about him, something hidden under his silent exterior, that made her feel like she had missed something important. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, maybe it was the way he never responded to her, or maybe it was the fact that she couldn't quite put her finger on who he really was. But whatever it was, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary passenger, and that his story was one she hadn't yet begun to uncover. The flight moved on and Clara continued her rounds, but the feeling from before lingered in the air like a fog. She couldn't shake the thought of the man in row 22. He was still seated by the window, eyes lost in something beyond the clouds outside. She tried to focus on her tasks, But each time she passed his seat, her gaze was drawn to him like a magnet. Pulling her in, she caught glimpses of his face, the stoic expression that never shifted. No matter how much she tried to read him, something about his stillness was unsettling. After a while, Clara decided to check on him again. She told herself it was just part of her job. She had to be thorough. But as she neared his row, her heart started beating faster. She tried to act natural as she approached. "Everything all right back here, sir?" she asked with a friendly smile. But the man didn't respond at first. His eyes stayed glued to the window, as if he didn't hear her at all. But then slowly, almost imperceptibly, his eyes shifted toward her just enough to let her know he was aware of her presence. For a moment, Clara thought he might finally speak, but instead he just nodded barely enough to be seen, his face still unreadable. He wasn't looking at her, he wasn't acknowledging her. In any real way, it felt like he was in another world. Altogether, Clara didn't know whether to be more confused or worried, but something about his silence started to gnaw at her. She couldn't resist one more attempt to make conversation. "You know you're not the only one who's been through some crazy things," she said, trying to make light of the situation. "We've got a lot of travelers on board with their own stories." But again, no answer, just the same cold stare staring through her, as though she wasn't even there. This time the silence stretched on far longer than she anticipated, and Clara felt her nerves begin to fray. She started to turn away, but something stopped her. The veteran's hand, which had been resting on the armrests, suddenly twitched, just a tiny movement, but it was enough to catch her attention. His fingers tightened for a split second, then relaxed again, as if something had startled him, but he made no sound, no movement beyond that. Clara stepped back slightly. Her instincts were telling her something wasn't right. She felt a strange unease creep up her spine, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. There was more to this man than just an old soldier trapped in his memories. But what was it? As the flight continued, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. When she passed him again, she couldn't help but glance over at his face. His eyes were still fixed outside, but something about his posture seemed different. It wasn't rigid anymore. It was almost like he was waiting for something. But for what? She couldn't help herself. She leaned toward him just a little and asked quietly, "What was it like for you back then? What did you see?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. It was a question she never meant to ask. But now that it was out there, she couldn't take it back. The veteran turned his head slightly, just enough to catch her eyes this time. But he didn't speak. Instead, his eyes narrowed for a brief moment, and Clara felt a shiver run through her. Then, without a word, he slowly reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. It was faded with age, but Clara could see that it was a group of soldiers standing together in front of a war-torn building. They were all smiling, but there was something in their eyes that didn't match the moment. Clara felt her pulse quicken as she stared at the photo, her curiosity growing deeper than before. The veteran didn't hand it to her, but he held it in front of him as though lost in the memory of a time long past. Clara tried not to stare, but she couldn't look away. The faces in the photo were young, but their eyes were not the eyes of carefree soldiers. They were haunted eyes that told stories of pain and loss, and Clara suddenly realized that the man she had dismissed so easily earlier was carrying a history so heavy that just seeing that photo might be enough to crush her. He finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "That was a lifetime ago." He muttered his words cold and detached, but they sent a chill through Clara's chest. And some things are better left buried. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she stood there frozen. She wanted to ask more. She wanted to know everything. But a sense of fear washed over her, the kind of fear that comes when you realize you've crossed a line you didn't even know existed. As the veteran slowly tucked the photo back into his pocket, Clara turned away, her thoughts spinning, trying to process what she had just witnessed. But one thing was clear: this man was no ordinary passenger, and whatever story he carried with him was far darker than she had ever imagined. The flight continued to cruise through the skies, but Clara couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. With every passing minute, her thoughts kept drifting back to the man in row 22. She found herself checking on him more frequently than she should have. The tension between them grew thicker each time she looked at him. He never seemed to notice. But she could feel it in the air. Something was changing, and she was caught in the middle of it. As the cabin lights dimmed for the night and the hum of the engines became a constant presence, Clara went about her duties, but her mind kept returning to the veteran. She couldn't let go of the haunting image of the photograph. He had shown her something about it, unsettled her. There was a story hidden in his eyes, one that she couldn't ignore no matter how hard she tried to focus on the other passengers. Something kept pulling her back to him. She checked on a few other rows and tried to continue with her routine, but her gaze kept flicking back to the man in row 22. He hadn't moved, still staring out of the window, as though he had forgotten he was even on a plane. A small part of her told herself he was just an old soldier lost in his memories, but another part whispered that there was more, something darker, buried beneath the surface. She walked past him once again, and this time something caught her eye. His hand was on his lap, but his fingers were trembling ever so slightly, a faint shake that she almost missed, but not quite. It wasn't enough to draw attention, but enough to make her wonder what was going on inside his mind. She had seen veterans before. They all had their scars from the past, but there was something about him that was different. It wasn't just the silence or the haunted eyes. There was a rawness to him, something she couldn't quite place. As she made her way toward the front of the cabin, Clara glanced back and saw the veteran's eyes shift. For the first time they locked onto hers in a way that felt deliberate. His gaze wasn't cold anymore, but intense, almost like he was seeing through her, seeing into something she didn't want to acknowledge. She felt her breath catch in her throat for a moment, but quickly looked away, telling herself it was just her imagination. She found herself walking back to him again, unable to stop herself. This time, as she neared his row, she didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching him. His eyes never left hers this time. There was no attempt to hide the weight of his past, no defensive wall-up, just a raw, unfiltered look that made Clara's heart race. She didn't know what to say, but she had to know more. "You're a soldier, aren't you?" She finally asked, her voice barely a whisper, not sure if she was even ready for the answer. He nodded slowly, his face still unreadable. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I've seen more than you could ever imagine." The words were low and heavy, but they hit her like a punch to the stomach. His voice carried the weight of years of experience, too much for anyone to carry alone. "More than you can handle," he added with a quiet finality that made Clara feel like the room had grown smaller, as though the walls were closing in around them. "Some things are better left forgotten." His words hung in the air like a warning, something that made Clara feel more uneasy than she had ever felt before. She wanted to ask him to tell her more, but her instincts screamed at her not to. She could feel it now, the dark presence that had been lurking just beneath the surface of the man's silence. This wasn't just some war veteran. This wasn't a man with a simple story to tell. He was carrying something dangerous, something that could destroy anyone foolish enough to ask too many questions. Before Clara could respond, the veteran turned his gaze back to the window, as if the conversation was over, as if she had never spoken. He seemed to withdraw into himself, once more, his body rigid, his mind miles away. She stood frozen for a moment, not knowing what to do with the questions swirling in her head. What was he really hiding? What was the truth behind the cold silence that surrounded him? As Clara slowly walked away, she felt the chill of the air press against her skin, and for the first time in a long while she wasn't sure whether it was the cold of the plane or the coldness of the man's past settling deep inside her soul. The flight had begun its descent into the next phase of the journey, but Clara could no longer focus on the routine tasks she had been so used to before. Every step she took seemed to bring her back to the man in row 22, the chill he left in the air, still lingered around her, as if his silence had left a mark on her soul. She tried to shake it off, convincing herself that she was overthinking things, but the truth was she couldn't stop herself from wondering about him, wondering about the dark history he was carrying. As she passed through the cabin again, she found her gaze drifting back to his seat. She had to know more. She couldn't leave this flight without understanding what lay behind that icy exterior, what had happened to him that made him so closed off from the world around him. Her steps slowed as she approached row 22. For what felt like the 100th time, she had no plan, no real intention, but something was pushing her forward. This time when she stood beside him, his eyes didn't flicker to meet hers. Instead, they remained fixed outside. His face was still blank, but there was something in the stillness of his presence that was different, somehow more intense, more alert, as though he was aware of her every movement, even though he showed no outward sign of it. Clara hesitated for a moment, then finally gathered the courage to speak. "Sir," she started quietly, "I know you've been through a lot, but if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." Her words felt small in comparison to the weight of the silence between them, but she needed him to know that she was listening. To her surprise, he slowly turned his head toward her, his eyes locking with hers for the briefest of moments, before he let out a soft sigh, his lips barely moving. "You don't want to know," he said, his voice almost too soft to hear. But Clara caught the underlying gravity in his words. They were heavy, with something deeper, something that hinted at pain. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she wasn't going to back down, not now, not after everything that had happened. "I think I do want to know," she replied softly, her voice trembling slightly from the vulnerability of the moment. He stared at her for a moment, his eyes unreadable. Then slowly he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. It was old, worn at the edges, the leather cracked from years of use. With one hand he opened it and turned the pages slowly, as if he was searching for something specific. Clara watched in silence as his fingers brushed over the pages. Then he stopped at one particular entry. His eyes narrowed for a second, as if the memory was painful. Without a word, he slid the notebook toward her. It was open to a photograph, a black and white image of a group of men standing in front of a building. The men were wearing military uniforms, and they all looked young. Their faces were serious, but there was something in their eyes that unsettled Clara. She didn't recognize any of the men, but she knew immediately that this was more than just a picture. This was a moment, frozen in time, a moment that had likely shaped everything about the veteran sitting in front of her. She looked up at him, but he didn't meet her gaze. His eyes were still focused on the photograph, his expression unreadable. "This was the last time I saw them," he said, his voice low and strained. "After that day, everything changed." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine as she stared at the photograph. She could feel the weight of the words behind it, the depth of the pain and loss that came with that simple image. She didn't know what had happened to the men in the photo, but she knew it wasn't good. She could feel the tension in the air thickening around her like a storm on the horizon. "What happened?" she asked softly, unable to stop herself, even as she feared the answer. The veteran's eyes flicked toward her for just a moment before he looked away again. "We were sent on a mission," he began slowly, his voice tinged with regret. "A mission no one was supposed to know about." He paused for a long time, his eyes narrowing, as if the words were hard to say. "We didn't know what we were walking into, but we had no choice." Clara felt her heart race as she leaned in closer, her curiosity overwhelming her fear. But the veteran's eyes never left the photo. His voice dropped even lower. "We were sent to do something terrible," he whispered, "something that would haunt us for the rest of our lives." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, and Clara realized that whatever had happened on that mission was far darker than she could ever imagine. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, as if the very air around her had turned suffocating. Finally, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't place, but there was a finality in them that made her heart ache. Some things are better left buried. He said, his voice harsh, as though the words themselves caused him pain. And with that, the conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Clara standing there with more questions than answers, her mind racing as she tried to process the fragments of a story she couldn't fully understand. Clara stood frozen, staring at the notebook in her hands, her heart pounding in her chest, as she tried to process what the veteran had just said. His words haunted her. Some things are better left buried. She couldn't shake them, no matter how hard she tried. The photo of the soldiers haunted her too, the faces frozen in time. But there was something else, something more unsettling about the way he had said it. It was as though she had crossed a line, one that should never be crossed. She couldn't help herself, though the questions burned in her mind. What had they done? What terrible mission had he been a part of? Why had he said it would haunt them for the rest of their lives? She glanced down at the notebook, once more, her hands trembling slightly, and then back at the man in row 22. He wasn't looking at her anymore. His eyes were lost somewhere in the distance. Outside the window, his face, a mask of emotionless indifference. Clara debated with herself for a moment. Part of her wanted to walk away. Part of her told her to leave it alone, to forget about it. But another part couldn't let go. The curiosity gnawed at her. She couldn't simply walk away from the weight of what he had shared, not after everything she had seen and heard. She knew she had to know more. She had to understand what had happened to this man to make him so distant, so broken. Slowly she moved back toward him, her steps cautious, as though she were approaching something dangerous. But she couldn't stop herself. She needed answers. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but still carrying the weight of urgency. He didn't react at first, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand twitched just slightly, as if bracing for something he didn't want to confront. She pressed on, "Please, you don't have to talk about it, if you don't want to, but I need to know what happened," she said, her voice full of a mix of desperation and empathy. She could see how much it hurt him to even think about it. But she also knew something terrible had happened, something that had shaped him into the person sitting in front of her now. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The only sound was the hum of the engines and the soft rustling of the air conditioning. Clara could feel the tension in the air between them thickening, but she refused to back down. This time she had to know. Finally he spoke, his voice low, his words slow, as if choosing each one carefully. "It wasn't supposed to be like that," he muttered, his eyes never leaving the window, as though the words were too painful to say aloud. "We were sent to help a village in need, a mission to protect them from forces far worse than we could imagine." Clara's heart quickened as she listened. She had never heard of a mission like that, but then again, she knew very little about the things soldiers were sent to do. "But we didn't know," the veteran continued, his voice thick with regret. "We didn't know that the village wasn't what it seemed. It wasn't just innocent civilians. It was a cover, a trap." He closed his eyes briefly before opening them again, his gaze distant. "We walked into a bloodbath. We didn't have a choice. We had to fight back. We didn't know who was who." Clara's stomach churned as she processed his words. She had heard of war zones, where things blurred, where everyone became an enemy. But this sounded like something far worse, something more sinister. "The mission was a lie," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion for the first time. "And the worst part is we never knew who we were really fighting." The silence that followed was heavy. Clara's mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what he had just said. Who were they really fighting? Why hadn't they been told the truth? Who was behind this mission? And why had it been kept secret? She didn't speak at first. She didn't know what to say. How could she respond to something so dark, so tragic? But the veteran wasn't finished. He finally turned his gaze toward her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability, a crack in the hard exterior that had kept him so distant. "We didn't just lose our comrades," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We lost ourselves." His words hung in the air like a confession that had taken years to utter, and Clara could feel the weight of it, the weight of the pain, and the truth buried beneath the silence of his words. She stood there in stunned silence, struggling to find the words to comfort him. But she knew there was nothing she could say, nothing that would take away the burden of the past he was carrying. Finally she spoke softly. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice full of empathy. "I can't imagine what you've been through." The veteran nodded slowly, as though the words had barely touched him. He stared down at his hands, his knuckles white from gripping the armrest so tightly, but Clara knew that he was reliving the horrors of that mission with every word he spoke. And as the plane continued its descent, the tension between them was unbearable. Clara realized that the man sitting in row 22 wasn't just a veteran. He was someone who had been through hell, someone who had seen the worst of humanity, and come back broken and scarred forever. The silence between Clara and the veteran felt suffocating now. Her mind was spinning with everything he had said. His words played over and over in her head like a broken record. We didn't know who we were really fighting. And that one line echoed louder than the rest. It haunted her. As she looked down at the photo again, the faces of those soldiers frozen in time. But they were more than just faces, weren't they? They were people with stories and secrets buried deep beneath the surface. Clara could sense that there was still so much she wasn't saying, and that made her heart race. Her curiosity gnawed at her like a beast eager for more. But she wasn't sure how far she could push him. How much more could he bear to tell her? She glanced at the veteran. He was still staring out the window, his face now a mask once more, but his fingers were tapping restlessly against the armrest. It was a subtle movement, but it spoke volumes about the storm brewing inside of him. She wondered what he was thinking, but knew better than to ask. Not yet. After a long pause, Clara took a deep breath and decided to press on. She couldn't leave him in this state. She couldn't let the questions fester unanswered. "Was anyone else there with you that day?" she asked, carefully keeping her voice as soft as she could. The veteran's eyes flicked toward her for a brief moment, and she caught the flash of something. Was it guilt? Fear? But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that same distant look, as if he had built a wall around himself to shield her from whatever horrors were hidden in his past. "There were others," he said, his voice steady, but Clara could hear the underlying tension. "Some survived, some didn't." His words were clipped, like he was choosing each one with caution, but Clara could feel the weight of them pressing down on her. "And the ones who didn't?" she whispered the question she wasn't sure she wanted the answer to. The veteran didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, his lips pressed into a thin line as though the memory itself was too much to bear. Then he opened them again, his gaze meeting hers for a brief instant before he turned his attention back to the window. "It's not something you'll ever understand," he said quietly, "not unless you've seen it with your own eyes." Clara swallowed hard. She had heard stories of war, the bloodshed, the chaos, but she couldn't imagine what it was like to live it, to face the brutality of it day in and day out, to make decisions that would haunt you for the rest of your life. "What happened that day?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but she had to know, she had to understand. He didn't answer immediately, and for a long moment Clara thought he wouldn't say anything at all, but then slowly his eyes focused on the photo again, and he exhaled sharply, as though the very act of speaking the words took every ounce of strength he had left. "We were set up," he said finally, his voice shaking slightly. "The village wasn't what it seemed. We weren't there to protect them. We were there to destroy them." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't comprehend the enormity of what he was saying. Destroy them? It didn't make sense. She tried to find the words, but they were stuck in her throat. He went on as if he couldn't stop himself now. "We were sent to clear the area to make it safe for other operations, but when we got there we found out the village had been working with the enemy. We didn't know who the enemy was, but we were told to treat them all as threats." His hands gripped the armrest tighter as he spoke, his voice rising with the intensity of the memory. "We walked into a massacre," he continued, his voice trembling now. "We didn't know who was who, and in the chaos, we did things we shouldn't have done, things I can never take back. The room felt colder as Clara listened, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the rawness in his voice, the regret, the anger, the shame that he carried like a weight on his shoulders, and for the first time she realized how much pain he had buried inside him. And the survivors, she whispered, unable to stop herself, what happened to them? He looked at her then, his gaze locking with hers for the first time in a long while. There was something in his eyes, something more than the stoic expression she had come to expect. They were left behind, he said softly. We didn't know what else to do. His voice cracked slightly with the admission, and for a moment Clara could see the ghost of the man he had been before the war, the man who had once been full of hope and life, but had been shattered by the things he had seen. Clara didn't know what to say. She felt as if she had uncovered a part of him that no one had ever seen before, a part that had been locked away for far too long, and now she was left holding the pieces of his story, wondering how it could possibly end. The silence stretched between them like a heavy blanket. Clara's mind was spinning. She couldn't stop thinking about the veterans' words. They were left behind, the survivors, left behind. What did that even mean? What kind of decision could make a man say something like that? She felt her stomach twist in knots as she tried to make sense of it. She looked down at the notebook again, the photograph staring back at her, as though it was judging her, asking her to understand something too terrible to comprehend. The veteran's gaze was distant, once more his eyes unfocused, as if the memories were pulling him away from the present. He didn't speak at first, and for a long time Clara didn't know if she should say anything or just leave him to his thoughts. But she couldn't walk away. She couldn't let it end here, not without understanding more. She had to know what had happened to him. She had to know why he couldn't move on. What happened to them? She asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. He didn't turn to her at first, his fingers tapping against the armrest in a slow, rhythmic motion, like a ticking clock counting down to something. But after a long moment, he spoke, his voice low and raw. We left them there in the village. He said, his words heavy with the weight of truth. We were told to move out, and we did. We didn't question it. We were just following orders. Clara's breath hitched. She couldn't imagine what that must have felt like, to leave people behind, to make that decision, and live with the consequences for the rest of your life. But it didn't feel right. He continued, his voice tight with the struggle to keep his composure. Something didn't sit right with me that day. I knew we weren't doing the right thing, but I was just a soldier. I didn't have the power to change anything. He shook his head, as though the words themselves were bitter to him. Clara's heart ached for him. There was nothing worse than being caught between loyalty and morality, nothing worse than realizing you were a part of something wrong and not being able to stop it. She wanted to reach out and comfort him, but she knew he wasn't ready for that. He wasn't ready to be comforted, not yet. The ones we left behind, he whispered, his voice barely above her breath. I still see their faces every night. His eyes closed as though the memory was too much to bear. I still hear their screams in my head. I'll never forget them. Clara felt the weight of his pain pressing down on her. Her throat felt tight, and she could hardly breathe as she tried to process everything he was saying. But the words felt like a storm raging inside of her, her mind screaming in the same way the veteran's memories seemed to scream inside him. Do you ever think about going back? She asked before she could stop herself. The question had slipped out, and now it was hanging in the air between them. He stiffened at the question, and for a long moment he didn't answer at all. His face had hardened again like a stone mask, but Clara could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fists clenched, as though even the thought of it caused him physical pain. There's nothing left to go back to, he finally said, his voice rough and hollow. Everything's changed. Nothing is the same anymore. He turned his gaze toward her, his eyes dark with regret. They're all gone, the ones who were left behind, the ones who survived. They're gone too. And I don't know if I could live with myself if I went back and saw what had happened to them after we left. His words struck Clara like a blow to the chest. She could feel the rawness of his grief in the pit of her stomach. It was a grief so deep that it consumed him from the inside out. She wanted to reach out. But she couldn't. She could only sit there and listen to him as he bared his soul to her. The veteran fell silent again, his eyes searching the vast expanse of the sky outside the window. Clara sat beside him, unsure of what to say, how to make sense of the pain that hung in the air between them, but she knew she couldn't let it end here. She couldn't just leave him like this, without trying to understand more. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Why now? Why after all these years?" He turned his gaze back to her, his eyes tired and filled with something she couldn't quite name. He took a long breath, and for a moment she thought he might not answer at all, but then he spoke slowly, his words tinged with sadness. "Because I can't carry it alone anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because for the first time in a long time, I'm starting to think maybe someone needs to know the truth. Maybe someone needs to hear it before I can finally let go." His words hung in the air like an unspoken plea for release. Clara didn't know how to respond, but in that moment she understood something she hadn't before. The weight of the past wasn't just his to carry. It was a burden that had been passed down to him, and now it was hers too. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't just walk away from this story, not now. The veteran had finally let go of a piece of the past, and it was up to Clara to decide what to do with it. Clara sat there in stunned silence, her mind swirling with everything the veteran had shared with her, the truth of the mission, the guilt, the weight of the past pressing down on both of them. She could feel the magnitude of the story she was now holding in her hands. It wasn't just his burden anymore, it was hers too. She had become a part of it, whether she wanted to or not. She glanced at the veteran again, his face still distant, his eyes hollow, as though he had spent too many years trapped in the prison of his own memories. But there was something else in his gaze now, something that wasn't there before. It was as if by finally telling someone the truth, a small part of the weight had been lifted off his shoulders, but it was still there, still heavy, still suffocating. Clara could see how much it had cost him to speak those words, to let go of the past, even for just a moment. And she realized then that this was the reason he had opened up to her, not because he wanted her sympathy, not because he was seeking redemption, but because he needed someone to hear him. He needed someone to know the truth before it consumed him entirely. She wasn't sure what to say, how to comfort him, how to make the pain go away, because nothing she could say would ever erase what he had been through or make it right again. But she knew something important now. She knew that no matter how dark the past was, no matter how heavy the guilt or the shame, there was always a way forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I believe you," she said. "I believe everything you've said." She could see the way his eyes flickered at her words, as if he wasn't sure what to make of them. But there was something there, a flicker of something human, a sign that he hadn't completely closed himself off from the world. "Thank you," he muttered barely above a whisper, and for the first time in the entire flight Clara saw him let out a long breath, as though he had been holding it in for years. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease just slightly, the weight of his story still there, but no longer as suffocating. But even as she felt a sense of connection with him, Clara knew this wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't the end of his pain. There was no quick fix, no way to undo the damage that had been done. But she also knew that sometimes just sharing the burden with someone else was enough to start the healing process. It wasn't about finding the answers. It was about the release, the simple act of speaking the truth into the world so that it could no longer haunt you alone. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." Clara said, her voice quiet but firm, and she meant it. She didn't know how much of the veteran's past she would ever fully understand, but she would listen, she would bear witness to his story, even if it was just in this moment, and that was enough for him. The veteran didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply nodded, his gaze turning once more to the window, as though he were looking at something far beyond the horizon, beyond the plain, beyond the past. But Clara knew in that moment that something had changed, something small but significant. And it was enough to remind her that no matter how broken someone was, there was always a chance for healing, if only they had someone to share the weight with. As the plane continued to descend, Clara felt a sense of finality settle over her. The journey was coming to an end, but the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. There was still so much left unsaid, but for now it didn't matter. What mattered was that the veteran had shared his truth with her, and that she had heard him. She had borne witness to the pain and the guilt and the sorrow, and for just a moment she felt like she understood him in a way no one else had ever tried to. The plane touched down, and the fastened seatbelt sign flickered off, but Clara stayed in her seat for a moment longer, her heart heavy with the weight of the story she now carried with her. She would never forget this conversation, never forget the man who had been forced to live with the scars of war, and she would carry the lesson with her always, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is simply to listen. As the passengers began to stand and gather their things, Clara glanced once more at the veteran, his face still as unreadable as before, but there was a subtle shift in the way he carried himself, a slight easing in his posture, as if just a little bit of the burden had been lifted from his shoulders. And for that moment, Clara knew she had made a difference, even if she didn't fully understand how. She left the plane with a sense of closure, but also a quiet sorrow for the man who had shared his past with her, and she couldn't help but wonder how many others were out there carrying the same weight alone.